Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Team Made Apart podcast is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammadeapart.com. Leveraging 20-plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Team Made Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Team Made Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammadeapart.com/talent. That's teammadeapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammadeapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be made in any amount and would go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammadeapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thanks in advance for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Hey there, and welcome back to the Team Made Apart podcast. Today's special guest is Molood Ceccarelli. Molood is the founder of Remote Forever, a consultancy which officially challenges the premise of collocation as a prerequisite to agility. Her company teaches geographically distributed teams how to work and communicate more effectively using Agile thinking and design methodology. In addition to her efforts as a remote work pioneer, for more than a decade she has been working as a developer, strategist, Agile coach, international keynote speaker, and host of the wildly popular Remote Forever Summit, which has seen more than 10,000 people in attendance. She's been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, and the Huffington Post as well. Joining us today for a conversation on how remote teams can work better together by employing Agile methodologies, the challenges of mastering great communication on distributed teams, the state of remote work as she sees it, and what the future has in store for remote teams as the pandemic subsides, please join me in welcoming to the show, Molood Ceccarelli. Hey Molood, how are you?
Hi Ryan, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. First thing, I've been trying to get in the habit of asking. I've not been very good about it. People who are listening to this season have already called me out on it. But where are you calling in from today?
I am calling in from Stockholm, Sweden.
Excellent. I love it. Well, and that's one of these things that I really try and emphasize in this show is just people are calling from all kinds of disparate parts of the world, right? So I like to show that we're at least practicing what we're preaching a little bit. So, Molood, let's just kind of, start a little bit at the beginning, and let's learn a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and how you ended up in sort of this remote work world.
All right. You gave a really good introduction, but I can just add a little bit to that. And that is, early in my career as a developer, I was introduced to Agile methodologies, and I was always interested in learning more about leadership and learning about myself. So I naturally positioned myself in a place of filling in the space for the team lead when he was on vacation and getting the opportunity to work as a Scrum Master or later on as an Agile coach. And back in 2016 was when I dared to look around, look at my experience up to that point, and admit that despite the Agile Manifesto and despite all of my mentors and coaches and the literature out there that claimed you need to be collocated in order to be Agile, what I had seen in reality was that the majority of the companies, the teams that I was working with, were not collocated. There was always an element of remote working in that. So I dared to challenge that premise with the first Remote Forever Summit that attracted 2,700 people, and the rest is history. So I built my company based on the success of that first summit, and I've come all the way to this point where I'm helping corporations and scale-ups that are implementing different ways of agile methodology and different aspects of agility into their business and are remote or have several different offices around the world. And I'm also starting to help smaller business owners and entrepreneurs who have hired a team and want to bring agility into their practice because they're more familiar with hiring remotely, and then bringing them the concepts of agility would be really valuable for them.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, first of all, I just want to comment on how cool I think it is that you were so assertive in your early days to try and move, into those positions and sort of know what you wanted in the first place. I think that, especially for young people, that's something that's a real challenge when you're working for a company or something, this idea that you could somehow step in and fill the role of a leader or even want to. I think the fact that that's just sort of where your head was at is really indicative of where you've come in all this short span. So congratulations on that. I think that's really cool. Well, and especially, I think too, not to get too political or tied up in sort of stereotypes or whatever, but I also think for young women, that's a difficult decision to make, especially if you have male leadership or something. It might be a little bit challenging to feel like you could step into that person's place, or you could feel a little out of place or alienated. So I really applaud you for doing that.
Thank you.
I wonder if we can maybe just also take a little foundational moment here and talk just about agility or agile as a process. I think a lot of people, especially if you work around, in and around technology, you've probably heard of these kinds of things, agile methodologies or design thinking, that sort of stuff. But I don't know that, your run-of-the-mill remote company or company who is maybe now recently remote due to COVID or other reasons, I'm not sure that everybody really understands what agility means or what agile means. Do you mind kind of breaking down what this methodology is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually good to know that Agile was created as a manifesto in 2001. And when Agile Manifesto was created, the people that created it had already been using different methods of agility in their own software businesses. So what was created as a manifesto was not something that was invented in 2001, but it was the manifestation of what was already in practice for 10, 15, 20 years in their own businesses. So what Agile is, in my humble opinion, it's a paradigm for developing products and services that promotes iteration, like iterative development and incremental development combined into one. So if you think about it, I usually explain what agile software development is with this example. I ask people if they remember the good old days of Microsoft Office, where you had to wait for a couple of years to get the latest CD and be surprised with all the new features that Microsoft had embedded in their Office products. And you remember that once upon a time, we were stuck with the paperclip helper who would just jump in the middle of your work and interrupt you, and everybody hated it. Some people loved it in the beginning, but if you were trying to get productive, it was such a distraction. It was such an interruptive thing, and you couldn't get rid of it. You had to wait for another 2 years for Microsoft to release a new version and remove that, right? And it took that long because the process of creating software was that long. You had to, the software developers at Microsoft had to go through different phases of the development process. That was, design and development and test and all of that. And that had a different name that was called waterfall. So for those of you who are not from software, you don't really need to know this or understand this, but it's good to know that it was such a slow process that you had to wait for that long. But nowadays, whatever application you have, even that same Microsoft Office, you get an update every couple of weeks, right? You get a notification on your phone and your app is updated. If you hate a feature, you give that feedback to the developers, to the company, and they remove it in 2 weeks, right? You don't have to wait for 2 years anymore. And that is powered by agile methodologies that allow the team to be responsive to the changes and the demands of the market. So that's in a nutshell what agility actually brings to the business. It's responding to change. And the way that it happens is by empowering people on the other side, by putting the focus on the humanity and the interactions that people have rather than following the perfect process and waiting for 2 years until every process is pitch perfect.
Yeah. Well, and I just love it. I mean, we use, versions of different processes. I mean, I don't run software, but I run a marketing agency. But we use like design thinking a lot and work in sprints and things like that, so we've pulled some of these little things from software that tend to work for us also. So, for anybody who's hearing this going, well, we don't work in software. We're just, I don't know, accountants or something, there's still probably something in this agile process for you. And I think it's definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is really about iterative value delivery to the customer, listening to your customer, hearing them, and actually giving them what they want, what the market wants. And it can be in any part of the business. It's not about software. But it's good to know that it was originated in software because it makes it more relatable, and it also makes it more okay when you don't want to accept a part of the process or a part of the prescribed methodology. And you're like, oh, I'm in marketing. That part does not apply to me. I don't want to follow that. And that allows you to break the rules a little more easily.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I really like about the processes is that it really encourages these one-on-one meetings, these daily stand-ups, these, all these different points of contact. And I think that can really help level up our communication in the office.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about, and you mentioned it earlier on, we also said it at the top in the introduction, but one of the things that made you unique anyway, just I guess in the spirit of you being a assertive young woman, was you noticed this gap, this different, this thing that was taking place where, this agile methodology had been written with collocation in mind. And you've sort of identified this gap where remote teams could start using this. Do you mind explaining a little bit that gap as you saw it, and then just sort of how a remote team might actually be able to use this in a better way?
Absolutely. This is actually a very simple part of what I noticed in the gap. I think the gap was due to a misunderstanding of one of the principles in the Agile Manifesto. And that was the fact that the authors of the manifesto had written, effective communication can happen when people are meeting face to face. And that's very true, right? But people had taken it a step further, and people who were writing books about it, who were creating courses about it, organizations that were creating certification programs about it, were taking it a little too far and were claiming that it would be impossible to become agile if you're not collocated, if you're not under the same roof with people. And then in the reality of my work, I always saw that people had to collaborate from different locations, right? And when I started answering this question, I said it comes from a very simple place, or it's really simple to explain it. And that comes to that very sentence of effective communication. I started asking myself, what is effective? What does effectiveness in communication mean? And then I had to go out and figure it out from the psychology perspective, from the communication perspective, from the sociology perspective. And I discovered a series of principles that allowed me to really understand what effectiveness in communication means at a deeper level. And it comes with empathy, and it comes with what many years ago Napoleon said. And here it is. This is a quote from Napoleon. He said, if an order can be misunderstood, it will be misunderstood. So in my words, effective communication is communication that cannot be misunderstood. And how can we do that? Do we need to depend on meeting each other every day, every hour, sit next to each other in order to make it effective? Or can we do it differently? And I think we can do this differently. We just need to have explicit agreements in place. We need to have effective processes in place. We need to have ways of using the systems and the tools and the processes so that we reduce the possibility of misunderstanding.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great. And I mean, I don't know if we can ever truly achieve this level of communication that, absolutely cannot be misunderstood. But the idea that the idea that we're aspiring to it, though, I think is critical. And I think that, that, like you said, I mean, actually what you just said, using it as your North Star, right? This is your guidance, I think is a great way to look at it, because you should also understand that, I mean, we're going to make up or make mistakes. We're going to do something wrong, here and there. And so I think it's okay, but I think as long as we're all aspiring for the right ththing, that's a good thing. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about then how we start to implement these processes, right? So, I mean, let's say we're a company, maybe prior to the pandemic, we were already remote, or at least doing some version of remote. And, maybe we see the pandemic as an opportunity for a fresh start, right? We're going to come back, we're going to do something new. We heard Molood speak at her conference, and she totally changed our mind on this agile process, or agile thinking. How do people, I guess, get started? If you've already had a process, you've already been doing things this certain way for so long, how do we start to implement stuff like this?
That's a very good one. I always help people to start with a retrospective. So if you have been introduced to agile ways of working, a retrospective is a very common meeting or event that people do, which allows people to look at how things are, how things have been, done in the past, and really reflect. What I think retrospective is an opportunity to take a pause in the middle of sprinting and really inspect so that you can adapt. So this possibility of inspect and adapt is the core to any successful business, right? You can't iterate on creating the perfect process. You actually need to create a good enough process, put it into practice, see how it plays out, and then take that pause and reflect and adapt. So I would say always, always, always start with a retrospective. And when I'm consulting, what that gives me is lots of amazing insights of how different individuals perceive their own ways of working, their own limitations, their own challenges. But then there are so many different aspects that come to that. So a very big part of creating an agile business is culture. And culture is not something that can be outsourced to an HR organization. It is something that is embedded in the organization. And when the team is remote, a part of the social activity, the social bonds that people used to have in an office is reduced. And if the company has always been remote, then there is a certain culture that cannot be translated into an in-office company, right? So I would say identifying the culture, figuring out what parts of it are actually its a strength and what parts of it are its weaknesses, and working with those and working with that in an intentional way, not outsourcing it to just another part of the organization. Having that glue of culture is also very important. What other aspects?
I just wanted to comment on that real quick too. I think you're right about culture, and I think that we're, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my inclination is that we're coming up on sort of a cultural crossroads, right? Because we had these companies that were remote prior to the pandemic, then we had many companies that were forced remote, or at least some version of remote during the pandemic, and now as we're Lord willing, getting to the end of the pandemic, people are going to return to offices. They're going to continue using the things they learned during COVID, all these different things. Mm-hmm. But I think we're going to start to hit sort of this cultural crossroads where you have to start making some decisions again, where, maybe you were remote before and things worked swimmingly and you survived the pandemic and it was no problem. But for the companies that experienced a lot of change, this could be the catalyst for some serious cultural change too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's that might actually be an opportunity to bring another sidetrack before I complete the answers to the previous question. And that is what culture is and what culture is not when and if you decide to go back to the office, whether it's fully or part-time or half of the people in the office and half of the people remote, like whatever you want to call it. If you're deciding that your company is going to have an office, you need to make an extra effort to create a remote first culture. And what that means is it's fundamentally different from an office first or a remote friendly culture. So in a remote friendly culture, you would say, yeah, I acknowledge that some people are remote. I acknowledge that, we're sitting in this conference room and those people are sitting in that other conference room. But we'll just make it work. Like we'll share the screen, we send each other screenshots, and you're not deliberate about inclusion. what remote first is that it's truly inclusive. You're always thinking from the perspective of the person who has the lowest communication bandwidth. And when I say communication bandwidth, I'm not talking about internet bandwidth. I'm talking about the possibility of communicating with you, whether it's through chat, whether it's through only screen sharing and chat, or it's audio and screen sharing and chat, or it's video and screen sharing and chat and audio. Different levels of bandwidth gives people different levels of access to effectiveness in the communication. And if you are going to have an office presence of any sort, you need to focus and make an extra effort in creating that culture that is truly inclusive, which in the remote work circles, we call it the remote first culture.
Yeah, no, I love that. And actually, I've been doing this show for a while, and I've never heard anybody put it quite that way. I think that this idea of sort of, manufacturing or building your remote first approach for the person with the least amount of communication bandwidth, I think that's a really unique perspective on this, because people throw around terms like remote first all the time, right? I mean, you hear that sort of thing all the time. But I've never heard anybody put it in that way. And I think that that's really smart. I mean, we hear a lot of, especially right now in the news, all this stuff about inclusion and diversity and all these things that are going on just sort of in our, political climate right now. But I don't think people think about inclusion as something like that, a technological advantage or disadvantage, or or even maybe it's a training advantage or disadvantage. Maybe they don't have the hardware or the software or the training or the, physical bandwidth, the internet. And so I think that
took me back to the old days.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting way of putting that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I just remember this memory. My husband sits on a wheelchair. And I remember I had a client who had an office, and I had to visit their office. And I was in their office, and I just called my husband and I said, "This is the most beautiful office I have ever seen. You have to come see this." And he came over there, and I was like, "I should show you the second floor." There was no way for me to take him to the second floor. It was impossible. It was only accessible through a set of stairs. And in that moment, I thought, this is an award-winning office. This is so beautiful, so amazingly built, but it's not accessible. And I talked to the person, who was a designer. She was a software designer, but I was talking to her about this. And then she said, well, I mean, if we had somebody on a wheelchair, they would work on the first floor. We would make sure that everything they need is in the first floor. And I thought that is not a truly accessible experience, because what if this person would like to see the upper floor, right? And when we think about technology, it's the same thing. So sometimes we have teams that work with certain software, certain tools, and then we have other team members who have no possibility of getting access to those tools. And when I say remote first, that means giving every single individual the same possibilities, the same experiences that they could potentially have.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great example of how inclusion can be difficult in the real world, right? I think generally speaking, I think most people would do their best to try and include everybody, right? I mean, I'm sure in this case where your husband was, discovered this place was not accessible, I'm sure that, it's not like they sought out to make the place not accessible for people. They just didn't have anyone they needed to cater to, so they hadn't done it yet. And so,
we didn't think about it.
Yeah. And I think so. I think what we're saying anyway, is at least when it comes to this idea of being accessible, if you cater to cater is maybe the wrong word, but if you design your culture or you design your accessibility to that person with the lowest communication bandwidth, for example, then, that should account for just about every circumstance. I mean, maybe you'll still miss a thing here and there, but I think you also mentioned this idea of being intentional, right? And I mean, by being intentional, working to what you can, possibly imagine, right? I mean, maybe there's going to be somebody that has a very unique situation that you can't have thought about in advance. But generally speaking, if you behave that way and sort of act that way and are intentional in the ways that you're making things accessible, then it seems to me that it would be, a very smart way to approach this.
Yeah, but just like the design, there was an elevator, but you couldn't get into that office floor of the second floor. Did I say that right? There was a part of the office that was only accessible through stairs, and that was a challenge. Now, when you translate that kind of like building design to remote work, I see a lot of companies that are quote unquote intentional, but what they end up designing is a remote friendly culture. And that is, we acknowledge that you're there as a remote person. We're going to have our meeting in the office. We're going to make the decision without you, but we'll make sure that you are aware of those decisions. The impact it has on the remote worker is that they're always feeling excluded or as a second-class citizen, right? They're not feeling truly included. So when I'm thinking, like when I'm teaching leadership, like remote leadership to leaders or work with them one-on-one, one of the core values that we work with is how to be intentional about creating this culture of inclusivity in the way that they lead and in the way that decisions are made.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, and I really like the parallels too, that you just mentioned with your husband too, because obviously remote work is a great option for a lot of people who aren't particularly mobile. And so, to have organizations that are thinking forward, enough to be able to accommodate people who may have some severe disability or something and who might not be, able to appear in an office or able to even make that video call. I think is really a great thing. And so I think there is something to being intentional. I try and balance this out a little bit with sort of, the employer, I think generally speaking, maybe not in every case, but I think generally speaking, they're doing their best, right? They're trying to figure stuff out.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's a little bit of a balancing act here on the side of the employee, right? If you are feeling excluded or if you are feeling left out because they're not meeting your accessibility needs, I still think there's a little bit of personal responsibility there, where you need to be informing your leadership, or you need to be, passing word back to people and letting them know, well, I don't feel included because of X, Y, and Z, right? Like, I mean, you can't expect everybody, I guess, to see the future or to understand how you might be feeling inside. Absolutely. So I think that there's kind of a two-way communication there. And I think a lot of times we get
That's why we call it culture.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in sort of the top-down version of it. How can the employer cater to the person who's working for them? And I think really it's sort of this two-way communication, or at least I think that,
Absolutely.
As we've been talking about improving our communication, this would be one other aspect of communication I think is really important.
Absolutely. Part of the culture that is remote first is having the psychological safety to talk about your needs. And the challenge that I see nowadays after vaccinations are rolling out and people are calling their employees back to the office is exactly that. They're not really intentional. At least some organizations are not that intentional about creating that culture and allowing that safety for people to speak up. Some people right now are, getting labeled as anti-vaxxers if they choose to opt out of getting vaccinations, and therefore they're not welcome in the office. And not that I advocate for this way or that way, but just putting it out there so we see that there is always going to be topics that divide people, that create polarity in the organization. And it is the responsibility of the leadership to make it okay for people to talk about their individual needs, to talk about what they prefer. And when we talk about remote first, it is really that. So I usually put my mission in those words. I say my mission is to empower every knowledge worker in the world to be able to contribute to their work in a meaningful way from any location and any device. And if you put it that way, I think it's including all sorts of circumstances and all sorts of actions that we need to take as employees and as employers to create that environment that allows people to be fully themselves and really feel like they're making an impact.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's a great topic too. You mentioned psychological safety. This is one of the things that I've been kind of throwing around lately, sort of as the pandemic is starting to slide, is, you start hearing these stories about people rushing back to work, get back to normal, the rush, whatever the new normal is, right? Let's go back to the way things were. And I sort of feel like, and I've mentioned this on other shows, but it's sort of this idea that it's a little bit of a disservice to people, right? I mean, people have basically experienced a year full of trauma now. Like we've been, tied to our houses. We've had lots of loss. People we know have passed away. There's like all kinds of things. You could never imagine the situation or the circumstance of every individual, right? And so this idea of just, okay, well, we're just going to pretend last year didn't happen and we're coming back to the office, for me feels really insensitive, right? It feels like you're just totally, disregarding the fact that I've been through a trauma this year. And so I think that there's this moment, or again, we talked about sort of a cultural crossroads where we're going to have to start making some decisions that will cater to a group of people who were just traumatized. And so I think that, as we talk about inclusion and trying to be better, and how we can be more inclusive of people, I think that's a big part of it, right? Is this rush back to the office, or, as it's been called, this rush back to the office, is this idea that, everybody's, who was formerly in co-located situations, now we're rushing back to the office. But I think this idea of forcing people to do it is where there's a real disconnect there. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts just sort of around that.
I think we can always put force and freedom on the opposite sides of the same spectrum. And real remote work is all about freedom. That's what I usually say. The essence of remote work is freedom to work from anywhere and any device. And, being able to contribute meaningfully, feeling empowered, feeling free, feeling like you want to just run around and come back to your computer and just deliver the work, having freedom over your work hours, which for a long time, it was called work flexibility. It was not even labeled as remote work before the pandemic, but now it is. But what we have experienced in 2020 and a few months of 2021 that we're in has been constantly going into lockdown and coming out of lockdown, and our freedoms being taken away from us because there was a health crisis that we had to live with. As you said, many people have been traumatized, whether they lost a relative or a loved one, or just this whole idea of being isolated. Maybe they were extremely sociable beings, and suddenly all of their, their well-being was taken away from them. Like social, mental, psychological well-being was taken away from them. So now what you see people have experienced, which got, unfortunately, the label of remote working, was the exact opposite of what remote working was supposed to give to people. So it was limitation versus freedom. Now you're forcing people to go back to an office. Are you giving them freedom? Are you giving them what remote work is supposed to be like? No, you're adding yet another trauma to this already traumatizing period. And that is very normal that many people would not like that. However, I also acknowledge that there are people who are super happy to have the option of going to the office. So as long as it is not a force, but it is an option, we're doing a great service to people. But as soon as you change the option, you remove the optionality or you remove the freedom, you're taking something very important away from people. And that's never okay for our own mental health.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, there's a couple things you talked about in there that I really like. So one is sort of this idea of isolation and sort of the mental effects or the well-being effects of being isolated. And it's funny because the reason I actually got into sort of, I guess, what we call remote work advocacy was this idea that I come to remote work basically as a freelance, right? Like we work for lots of really big companies, but I've always been a freelancer. I've never worked as a remote employee for a tech company or something, for example. Mm-hmm. And so, but I come in as a freelancer. So I too have a lot of the problems where it's, I spend a lot of time by myself, or I'm working out of these remote work facilities and things like this. But so I came in from this idea that basically I was, and the reason we call this company Team Made Apart is I was the team made apart, right? I was this guy who's always on the outside, never really part of the company, even though I was doing their big marketing, pushes or their campaigns, these sorts of things. But I was always this person on the outside. And so part of our objective or part of our purpose was to increase communication and build better relationships among remote teams, right? Because we want to have these relationships, and as freelancers, we get excluded a lot. We're sort of on the outside. We're never on the inside of the corporate stuff. And so that was sort of the thing that brought us in, or brought me into this sort of remote work world. And so that's been my big push, right? And so during COVID, for example, or during the pandemic, we did a 12-part series of podcasts on just strictly mental health, where we had doctors on and psychologists on and all kinds of people just to talk about these different aspects of mental health. But it's for exactly what you're talking about, right? So, but to try and pretend now as we're returning to the office that isn't traumatic for people to have spent a long time alone. And, and I'm pretty blessed, really. I mean, we live here in the US. We have a fair amount of, real estate. We have some property. We have a backyard. I live with a family, so I have my family here. So even though I was isolated to our group of 4, and I was isolated to my big backyard and things like that. Where meanwhile, the people, I have some people who work for me in Spain. They live in a teeny little flat. They live by themselves. They do, all this stuff. And so they're locked down in Spain, and, they're a very social culture to begin with. But so they're totally locked down. They're living in their tiny little apartment. and, all by themselves. Like, I mean, what does that do to a person? I mean, it's the same as being imprisoned or something. And
yeah, it actually is. I am first example of that. Like, I have seen myself like going through all of that and having to work very hard to stay healthy mentally and physically. I live in Sweden, a country that never went to lockdown. And many people who don't know what is going on here look at Sweden and are like, look at them. They've had this amazing life, right? But what I see is that I have family members who are vulnerable. So we had to take personal decision to stay at home. And we've been at home for 14 months at the time that we're recording this video. In the last 14 months, I've exited the door of my apartment 10 times. That's it. Oh, wow. 10 times to go pick up packages. Just imagine that, like in 14 months, you only go out that much. And I used to be a person who had never worked from my home before. I was a remote worker for many years. And I always worked from cafes and hotel lobbies, and I loved traveling, and I was around, I never worked from home. So when we made that decision to work from home, we thought, yeah, it's going to be like a couple of months. The government is going to manage it. We're going to just be back to normal. And that wasn't the case. I had to purchase a desk and set up the corner of my tiny apartment to make it possible to work from it. I upgraded my portable, like I had a portable studio that I could just set up a studio in a hotel lobby and I was good to go for recording or meeting. So this whole change was a big deal to me personally. Even though I was a big advocate of remote work, I never called it work from home. Because to me, it was always about that freedom. But now I see that people have experienced only work from home and they're like, I hate remote work. It's so isolating. It's so terrible. I want to go back to the office. But what I say is I want to go back to remote work. Yeah. I really do.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I appreciate you sort of sharing your experience, because that's actually been kind of my thing too, is, I've always gone back and forth on how much responsibility your social life should be of the employer versus how much it should be your problem, right? So you've got all these employers, rising to the occasion and doing virtual happy hours and, game nights and things like that. They're doing all these fun things. And, but I also have always felt like, your social life should sort of be partly your problem. It's not the sort of thing that you need to get from an employer. And, and while I think you ought to have a good social interaction with the people you work with, at the same time, you shouldn't be totally dependent on your employer for social time. And during the pandemic, at least in my experience, I was in a situation where, we've always been on the outside of the company. So we know people in the business, but usually it's just our point of contact or one or two other people in the organization, so we've never really demanded those guys for our social interaction. But then with lockdown, our local cafes, our co-working spaces, all these places have been closed. And so for me, it just like almost exactly what you described, it became a work from home situation, right? So I started working from home instead of working from wherever. And I've seen a real change in myself over the last couple of years in just, and I mean, honestly, it's why I was so excited to start the podcast again this year, was because I don't talk to anybody. I sit in my little room and I work, and I'm there all day, every day. And then, eventually, our kids have gone back to school and stuff like that. So they come home and the family gets here. But I'm still spending the lion's share of the day alone staring at a computer screen. Yeah. And that used to be, even if I didn't really talk to anybody, I was at least in a co-working facility where there were other people and people moving around, and maybe you say hi to somebody at the drinking fountain or whatever. But, it didn't take a lot to feel social. But once it's been sort of totally taken away, you start to understand how that is. And I'm sure our situation isn't unique. I'm sure there are a large number of people who can sort of relate. But I've definitely seen a dip in sort of my personality, my drive, my sort of motivation to get out and hustle and all this stuff. And really, we haven't had it as bad as a lot of places have. I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and in Utah, it's Wild West, like cowboys out here. It's pretty open. And
I usually just look at people like you and myself as so fortunate, because we weren't part of the group of people whose jobs disappeared due to the lockdowns and the pandemic. We are connected. You and I met each other during the pandemic. How could we possibly run into each other if it wasn't for this being isolated and seeking connection with other human beings for us to meet, right? And that's part of us, both of us, taking personal responsibility for keeping connected, being social. And as you said, it is important that we acknowledge that, yes, it is, necessary to socialize with your coworkers. But if you don't have that possibility, it's not the job of your employers to create that. It is really your own job to go after that and satisfy your needs for socializing.
Well, I love that. And I think it's indicative of sort of the personality of a typical remote worker, which I think is a lot of times a little bit entrepreneurial. They're willing to go out and kind of do the extra work to, I guess, in exchange for the freedom of being able to work from wherever they want. And I really like that phrase you use, the idea of personal responsibility. I think that we, especially as remote workers, and I think those people who really thrive as remote workers, and not to say this is inclusive of everybody. I mean, obviously there are people who take personal responsibility for all kinds of things, but I think that this is a character trait of people who thrive as remote workers. And so I really like, the use of that term in sort of talking about not just the social life, but also as you do the work, right? I mean, if for your remote workers, and again, maybe going back to this idea of a remote first mentality, so much of what we do is based on our outputs, and with no personal responsibility, it's mighty hard to achieve what you're supposed to get done.
Absolutely.
So let's, I guess, maybe circle back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, although I could go on with this for a little while because I'm actually enjoying just having somebody to talk to about all this stuff. But let's talk a little bit more about just sort of communication in the office and how agile processes can help us be better. I've heard a lot of examples of, people, using certain kinds of meetings for certain things and using certain sorts of technology or tools to facilitate communication. But I wonder if you could sort of give us a little bit of a case study of what an agile process might look like, or like a day in the life of a remote team working agilely. I don't know if agilely is a word, but working in an agile way.
Agilely. That's a good word. You should put that in the Urban Dictionary. Exactly. I really tried to put some words in the Urban Dictionary. They weren't broadly used. They weren't used enough on the internet for them to get there.
That's right. We'll get some. So I will for sure make up some words during this conversation, so we will do that.
Cool. Yeah, you should do that. All right. So let me just explain two different concepts that we need to truly understand from Agile, and then give you a rundown of a typical workday of a team member in an Agile team that is working remotely, or a remote team member that is working agilely. And then the concept number one is simplicity, and concept number two is visualization. Simplicity in Agile is defined as the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. Now, when you think about that, it's a little controversial, right? The art of maximizing the amount of work not done. When you think about it from a remote work perspective, it can be applied to not only the work that you accumulate in your backlog and in your to-do list, but also to different aspects of how you need to communicate with your coworkers, including the number of tools that you use. So one of the things that I have created is defining simplicity for a remote Agile team, and it is maximizing the number of tools not used. That's taken from the simplicity definition there. And it comes back to that idea of North Star. Imagine if you had only one tool to communicate with your colleagues. Which tool would that be? Which one of your many tools, many softwares that you use on a daily basis would you pick if you only had a choice of one? Now, I know that it's a very difficult question because we're so dependent on scattering the different means of communication and the different parts of the information in these different tools, right? So I always help people to work with creating simplicity in their tool sets and in their processes. Now comes the concept of visualization, as I mentioned. Visualization means making the work visible so that every single individual in the team knows what is going on and what is going to happen in the future at any time they need that information. Now, when you think about those two together, it's a very difficult goal to achieve, to have visible work and make sure that everything is simple. And as we said earlier, it cannot be misunderstood, right? Three very difficult concepts put together. Now, looking at a normal workday of a really great remote team that is working Agile is if you're a developer, designer, marketer, and you have those explicit agreements, you know exactly which tool is being used for managing your work. You know exactly where to communicate with your team members, whether it's in the project management tool or in your chat tool, or whether you have to book a meeting and you're still dependent on meetings. You should know exactly which tool is used for what type of communication. And if you have that one tool, it's usually the task management system or the project management system. So you go into that tool, first thing in the morning, you probably say hello in the chat tool to your team members, or you go to that project management tool and somehow through the explicit agreements that you have, notify the team members that you have picked a new task. You move the status of that task and you start working on that. And if there is an update, you update that particular task in the task management system. Why? Because maybe somebody else on your team in a different time zone has already picked up a task and is waiting for you to start working on this so that you can actually exchange some information in the middle of the day. You might need to meet someone in person. You do that. A lot of Agile teams take this concept from Scrum, which is one of the Agile methodologies. That's the daily Scrum. Some teams call it the daily huddle. Some call it the check-in. Sometimes it's a meeting that you show up to in order to make sure that the whole team is working on the right things. The mistake that I see often is that people go there and report the status of their work, and they completely forget that the goal of that meeting is to make sure that we're all working on the right thing. Sometimes it's done asynchronously and in writing. And that's usually taken with a prompt, either in the task management tool, like Basecamp has that possibility, or it's in the chat tool. And the reason why you report that to your team members is, once again, to know and make sure that you're working on the right thing. So what if you're not working on the right thing? What if you say something and your colleague says, why are you working on that campaign? That's we collected some data and we decided to discard that campaign. Let's not do that. So what happens then is that you get that notification and you're acknowledged and you have that instant conversation. You can either hop on a call or you can just communicate back and forth in writing until you have clarity. You have absolute clarity of what to work on that very day. And voila, you start working, you finish your day, you update the tool, you make sure that the information in the tool is updated at least once a day. And that's how you end your day. And every 2 weeks, every week, depending on what your agreement is, that would be the end of your sprint. You come together, you take a pause, and you retrospect. You look back at how you've worked, what has worked, what hasn't worked, in order to improve the future. And the reason why you do that at a cadence is so that you can make sure that you're continuously improving your processes, your communication, and everything else that surrounds your work.
Yeah, I think maybe my new favorite thing is this idea of the retrospect. This part of the process that is looking back at your day, your week, your month, whatever. I think so many of us, and I'm for sure guilty of this, just sort of live in the moment and go forward, right? We don't spend a lot of time looking backwards, yeah. Right? And my organization is small, and we leverage remote resources, and we sort of grow, and shrink based on workload and stuff like that. So we have limited processes, and a lot of times even it will shrink down to the point where I'm doing almost everything. And when it's down to that point, like I don't need to communicate with anybody anymore. It's just me, right? So our processes fall short a lot. And I can just see how working something in, like every Friday, if I just took an hour in the morning and thought about what could I have improved or how could I have done something better during the week, I think that would have been really great. It's almost like, if you applied this to your personal life, it would be almost like journaling or something, right? And sort of thinking about what had happened to me on any given day, and then using the collective knowledge gained from writing down all these experiences to sort of improve or look better, at your life. And so I really love that concept. I think that's pretty awesome.
I'd like to add something to that, Ren, and that is the idea of looking back, not only to look for what is not working or what could have been improved, but also to look at what is working. Because I've seen time and time again that personally, I forget what was working before. And as soon as I remember it, I'm like, right, that used to work. Why did I stop doing that? right? And it is true for teams too. Some practice is really working in your team, but if you don't acknowledge it, you might drop it on the go. And it's good to pronounce it, to articulate it, so that you don't ever forget it, that you continue working with your strengths at the same time as you're improving the weaknesses.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, maybe I just showed my cards a little bit, and that I went right to the negative, right? That I was just look at the things that didn't work.
Yeah,
I think, but I also think
that's the human psychology. We all do that.
I think that's sort of the default mode, right? I think most people will look at what didn't work versus looking at what did.
Yeah.
And so I think taking that extra breath and making sure that we do that, I think, is critical. The other piece I wanted to talk about a little bit more. So like in a remote organization, even if we're using agile processes, I mean, obviously these scrum meetings or stand-ups or whatever you want to call them are one component of how meetings are handled in an agile workflow. How do we handle sort of other meetings, or how do we make sure that meetings don't overwhelm our day or whatever? Because I know for a lot of organizations, it's how we handle the meetings that actually sort of can dictate our day. They can sort of be overwhelming and take over everything. They can disrupt our workflow. And Agile accounts for at least one meeting, but I wonder if there's more to that, or if there's more, more in that approach that you might employ if you were trying to make sure your meetings weren't taking people off track.
You're taking me right to another pillar of the work that I do with clients, and that is another North Star for communication. So I usually, after I get to know the clients, I usually introduce my signature rule, which is the rule of no meeting is mandatory. And before you panic, especially if you're a manager in a company, before you panic and you're like, oh my God, if no meeting is mandatory, nobody's going to show up to my meeting. What am I going to do then? Take a breath, take a pause, and just look back at why we have meetings in the first place, right? You said daily scrum is something that people have by default, but why is it a meeting? Do we actually need a meeting for that? I just give you an example of how so many remote teams actually do this asynchronously and in writing, which means they don't meet at all. So if no meeting was mandatory, that means every single time you're calling for a meeting, you make sure that the purpose of the meeting is absolutely clear, that the desired outcome is absolutely clear, that you know exactly who to invite and why those certain individuals are being invited, and you communicate that clearly to them so they have a choice. And you also make an effort to make that meeting an engaging activity. So it won't be a manager usually talking at people, but rather a workshop, an opportunity to collaborate together, to co-create together. A lot of times people forget that meetings are taking so much of our time, and that should be counted as work that we do. But in reality, what happens is that meetings are usually places where decisions about what needs to be done take place, right? How could we turn that around? How could we make meetings so that they become workshops? So what I help people is to learn skills, which I call online facilitation. I have a 5-week program that teaches people online facilitation. And it's not only about how to facilitate meetings, but it's about how to facilitate communication and conversation, whether it is asynchronous or in real time. So if you learn online facilitation, you can turn any boring meeting into an engaging and energizing workshop where work really happens. So back to the beginning of my answer. With the simple rule, no meeting is mandatory. If you implement that in your organization, whether it's a small team or a large organization, your meetings instantly become better because the purpose and the outcome and what's in it for me gets clear. So you can motivate people to show up.
Yeah, no, I think that's tremendous. And actually, I think there's a really great point in there that is this idea that, at least sort of in my experience in office, which is, I will admit, sort of limited, when working in an office, there's an abundance of meetings, more probably than are necessary. And I think that this idea of being purposeful and, separate even of becoming a great facilitator, but just understanding the purpose for your meeting and does it really even need to exist, I think is a little bit of introspection that a lot of people don't take. They just go, okay, well, we're going to meet on this because we always meet on this. And, it's a little bit of that, we've always done it this way, so we're going to continue doing it this way. And I think that's, just with a little audit, you could find out that, probably some, 50, 60% or maybe more of your meetings aren't even required. So I think that your idea of no meeting is mandatory puts a little bit of extra pressure, right? Because if your meeting isn't worth going to, or if your meeting is seen as a draw on other people's time and it doesn't really move forward, well, then nobody's going to come, right? But if your meetings are always useful and the work that gets done during the meeting actually moves the ball forward or helps a project proceed or whatever, then those people will come. I mean, mandatory or not, they'll come. It's funny. We had a guy on the first episode of this season, a guy named Chris Dyer, and he had a really unique approach to meetings too. And some of it is this, prioritizing sort of meetings by, he uses sort of animal metaphors and things like that, right? Like, and I'll probably butcher this, but a cockroach meeting is a meeting where we get together to talk about this thing, but it's pretty insignificant. It's not mandatory, blah, blah, blah. And that goes all the way up to whatever it was, a tiger meeting or something. And a tiger meeting is all hands on deck. Everyone must attend, this kind of thing, right? But it I think circles back or sort of reinforces your idea that is, we need to make sure that what we're talking about is actually worthy of talking about. And if it's not, by making it not
in
mandatory,
real time, I emphasize on that.
Yeah. And I think by making it not
I emphasize on the fact that it's worthy of talking about it in real time, because we always need to ask ourselves the question, do we actually need to have a meeting for this? Do we need to call 200 people to be online in real time so that we can inform them of a certain thing? Or can that certain topic be recorded so they could watch it at their own time? Can you do this any other way? Can this communication be effective in a different way?
Yeah, I love that. And I guess that goes back to this remote first idea, right? I mean, if you've got to get everybody coordinated for a Zoom call, I mean, it's going to be an inconvenience, right? How are you going to get 200 people to have all their schedules line up, especially if you're sort of geographically distributed and you've got different time zones to contend with and all this? So I imagine it would force leaders to really, think about the meetings they need to have and how important is this thing. And I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, I think so. We're starting to get to the end of this. I wondered if you had any sort of, final advice or parting shots, for people who might want to learn a little bit more about, either agile processes or design thinking, or how they might sort of adapt into what's next for remote work.
Wow, that's like 3 or 4 questions embedded in one.
Feel free to choose the shortest answer.
All right, for learning about Agile, there is a lot of bad information out there. So be careful who you learn from, be careful where you get your knowledge, because Agile has been around for 20 years now, and there is a lot of misunderstandings about it. Go back to the source, learn the history, learn from the founders, learn from the best. That's my first advice when it comes to Agile. And when it comes to remote working, remember that the essence of remote working is about freedom. Everything else that gets the label remote work and is encouraging removing part of your optionality, part of your freedom, please don't give it that label of remote working, and just embrace remote working the way that it was meant to be, the way that it was supposed to bring you all the beauties of a life well lived, a life lived fully, where you have a chance to be with your family, your loved ones, your friends, and the social life that you have. Yeah. And you asked me how people can get in touch with me or learn from me. Is that part of the question?
Yep.
Too?
Just here to sort of close up, where can people find you online? Where can they engage with you if they would like to maybe learn more about the work you do?
So you can visit my website, remoteforever.com. You can come to my conference, which Ryan mentioned in the introduction. It's remoteforeversummit.com. It's a free summit that happens every year. You can get in touch with me on social media. I go with Remote Forever on all social media, Clubhouse, Instagram, Twitter. And on LinkedIn, I usually write as myself, so Molood Ceccarelli, you can find me there. And I answer to every single message. So if you write to me, you can expect an answer.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Molood. This has been awesome. I'm really grateful. I mean, you and I have crossed paths a few times, but we've never actually spoken. So this has been really great, and a great pleasure to meet you.
Same. Thank you so much for having me, Ryan.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week. And we'll see you all next time.